It's hard to believe, but a national so-called news anchor has actually suggested on national television that the Biden administration and the U.S. military could use drone strikes on U.S. soil against U.S. citizens who are deemed to be a national security threat by inciting violence.
And in the case of Anwar al-Awlaki, an American, a Yemeni American, with a drone strike for the crime of inciting violence, inciting terrorism.
We're going to tell you why that news anchor actually made two comments and why those comments are not only immoral, but are factually wrong. I'm Ben Swann, and there has never been a time when we so badly needed truth in media. Hey guys, welcome to the show. So much to get to today. We're going to be talking about these comments made by an anchor over at MSNBC, where yes, she suggested using drone strikes on U.S. citizens on U.S. soil who might be inciting violence. We all know what that means. Saying the wrong things on social media or in public or even in the privacy of your own home. And she believes that the U.S. military should kill you with a drone strike. We're going to talk about that today. Before we do, a shout out to our sponsor for this episode, ISE.media, our new free speech platform, which by the way is only weeks away from its full launch. We are so excited to be showing you what this is going to look like, because we're not only incorporating the very best content from content creators who are being purged across the internet, but we are now including a social media component as well. It is going to be an all-inclusive site and a place where free speech can actually be heard. ISE.media. All right, so let's talk about these comments that were made. And the best way to start is just not me explaining them to you, by letting you hear this for yourself. Listen to this.
We had a policy, and it was very controversial. It was carried out under the Bush years and under the Obama years, of attacking terrorism at its root, of going after and killing. And in the case of Anwar al-Awlaki, an American, a Yemeni American, with a drone strike for the crime of inciting violence, inciting terrorism. Mitch McConnell was in the Senate then. He was in the Senate after 9/11 too. How does Mitch McConnell, who understands that the way you root out terrorism is to take on, in the case of Islamic terrorism, kill those who incite it, how does he not vote to convict someone that he said on the floor of the Senate incited an insurrection?
Now, those comments were made by an anchor over at MSNBC, and the fact is, what she's talking about there specifically is the killing of a Muslim cleric by the name of Anwar al-Awlaki, who was killed by drone strike in 2011. His 16-year-old son, Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, was killed 2 weeks later, also in a drone strike, also in Yemen. Now, what these two people had in common, this father and son, is that they were both U.S. citizens living abroad at the time. The Obama administration had chosen to use a drone strike in order to kill these two individuals, claiming that Anwar al-Awlaki was inciting violence with the words that he was saying. His 16-year-old son, the Pentagon actually lied about and claimed was actually an enemy combatant and 21 years old when they first killed him. It later came out he was 16 and was not involved in any kind of military action whatsoever. In fact, he was killed at a barbecue. Back in 2012, I became the very first reporter ever to question President Obama about these killings. Here's what I said back then.
Well, let me ask you then also about the so-called presidential kill list that's gotten a lot of attention, and this list of folks who have been targeted for assassination. Right. And on that list have been U.S. citizens who have not been afforded trial, including Anwar al-Awlaki. How do you, as president, or any president for that matter, regardless of party or person, utilize that power to assassinate even U.S. citizens?
Well, first of all, you're basing this on reports in the news that have never been confirmed by me, and I don't talk about our national security decisions in that way.
Again, that was 2012 when I questioned President Obama about the killing of those U.S. citizens. And as I said at that time, and I would say it again today, no president has the authority to declare unilaterally the execution, the assassination of a U.S. citizen anywhere in the world, let alone on U.S. soil, without due process, without a trial, without going through the criminal process. Simply declaring someone an enemy combatant because of what they say and declaring that you can have them assassinated is flatly illegal. President Obama used and abused this power, but the problem at the time was that Republicans didn't actually push back against it. They appreciated his use of this power and they applauded him for it. Democrats applauded him for it. And so both of the ruling parties in Washington agreed with the decision that the then president made to unilaterally declare a U.S. citizen an enemy of the state and to have him executed, even though that enemy of the state, so-called, wasn't even on a field of battle in a country we were at war with, because we have never had a declared war in Yemen, even though the Bush administration and the Obama administration have bombed incessantly the country of Yemen. We have had no declared war. Now, what the Obama administration has told us is that the reason that we are bombing and have had these incessant number of drone strikes in the country of Yemen all the way back to 2004, but especially ramping up in 2010, was because of the emergence of something called AQAP, or Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. That's what we have been told for the last few years, that the reason there were drone strikes happening in Yemen was because of the rise of AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. That, however, is simply not true. Now, it's important to understand that what our government has told us and what the media has told us about Anwar al-Awlaki is very confusing. And the reason for that is because we have been told that he was inciting violence by encouraging and inspiring potential terrorists, the underwear bomber, the shoe bomber, and the Fort Hood shooter Nidal Hasan. The problem, of course, is that the Fort Hood shooter was not executed for actually shooting people at the military post on Fort Hood. However, the person who supposedly inspired him with his words was executed by drone strike in Yemen. The truth of the matter is that Anwar al-Awlaki was a Muslim cleric who was actually operating in Virginia, and after 9/11 was actually invited to the White House multiple times to be sort of an advisor on how to deal with the Muslim community. When the FBI began placing listening devices and recording devices in mosques around the country without warrants, they were looking for people who were potential terrorists, and he began speaking out about that. He also began speaking out about what he perceived as the mistreatment of Muslims in the United States and around the world. He actually left the United States and went to Yemen, again, a country we were not and are still not technically at war with. And yet, Anwar al-Awlaki was executed by drone strike by the U.S. government under orders from President Obama. Now, the other thing that's important about this story, though, is the fact that the news anchor from MSNBC, who made this ridiculous statement, made a second statement. I want to play it for you again. Listen to this.
How does Mitch McConnell, who understands that the way you root out terrorism is to take on, in the case of Islamic terrorism, kill those who incite it, how does he not vote to convict someone that he said on the floor of the Senate incited an insurrection?
One of the things she said there was that one of the ways we have learned to root out and end terrorism is to go to these root sources and essentially, her words, to kill the perpetrators or those who incite violence. That, of course, is entirely untrue. In fact, the very opposite is actually true. So one of the things that I think is so important about this story is when you consider the fact that the United States began drone strikes in Yemen around 2004. But look at this chart. Under the Obama administration, those drone strikes increased significantly in 2011, 2012, 13, and 14. Even though the numbers were declining, 2012 was our highest year, and we still had dozens of drone strikes every single year surrounding this period. Why is that significant? Why is it important? It's important because of the fact that Al-Qaeda in Yemen was actually not a force until when? Until around 2010. You see, Al-Qaeda in Yemen was actually a very small organization that had very little support in the country of Yemen. They were not taken seriously by the people in Yemen. There are many, many articles that talk about this fact. And yet, 2012, right at the time that the United States began significantly increasing the number of drone strikes in that country, Al-Qaeda began to grow, not become smaller, began to grow. In fact, in 2010, when the United States first designated AQAP, or Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, as an actual terrorist threat, at that time, there were only a couple hundred people who were a part of Al-Qaeda in Yemen. By 2011 and 2012, that number had moved into the thousands. By the year 2014, as we have seen for 4 years, drone strikes in Yemen, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was over 4,000 members strong. The reason this is significant is because the idea that if you go around and execute people with whom you disagree or who are saying things you disagree with, you will root out extremism is absolutely false. The truth is that by executing Anwar al-Awlaki, by executing his 16-year-old son, by executing thousands of people across the country of Yemen, the United States did not de-escalate extremism in Yemen. It created extremism. We grew extremism across the country of Yemen. From 2010 to 2014, we saw the number of people who were a part of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula move from a couple hundred people to over 4,000 recorded people in the year 2014 after 4 years of devastating drone strikes. That is the reality of what happens when you execute people for believing things differently than you do. This is important. Now, some of you out there who are watching will say, Ben, this doesn't matter. Who cares about Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula? But it's very important. It's important because when you don't learn from what these people are doing, then you will not understand what they are trying to do. If you look at what they've done in the past, you can then understand what they're trying to do in the present. In the past, the Obama administration, the Bush administration, attempted to use drone strikes in order, they said, to squash extremism. And yet all across the Middle East, we actually saw an increase in extremism. We saw the birth of new chapters of Al-Qaeda across the Middle East. We saw the rise of ISIS. Why? Why do we see these groups continuing to grow and proliferate? The reason for that is very simple. Because when you destroy people's livelihoods and you put them into a state of war, you take people who otherwise would not be extremists and you make them extreme. It is the record of what we have done in the Middle East. In fact, what we know for a fact is that throughout the war on terror, the U.S. war on terror in the Middle East, there are only two things that have come from our war on terror that began on September 11th, 2001. The war on terror, which officially began with the attacks on 9/11, when the United States began that war, two things emerged from our war on terrorism: more war and more terrorism. That is an historical fact. It is undisputable. So when I hear people like news anchors, so-called, on these news channels talking about the way to root out domestic extremism in the United States is to execute people who think differently or people who might be inciting violence, what they're actually attempting to do is create extremism. Listen very carefully to what I'm saying to you. The only reason you talk about executing people who might be extremist in their language or their identity or their political beliefs is to create extremism in those same areas. That is the only reason it is done.